At the start of studying sociology, you would have looked at a lot of theories about things like why do working class kids not do as good in school, or why are working class kids more likely to join gangs? Well, today we're going to look at the methods that those sociologists use to support those theories. Okay, so before we carry on, you need to make sure that you know these key 9 methods listed on the table next to me right now. And if you don't yet know about these methods, how to define them, the strengths and the weaknesses of them, then we want you to visit this link listed just above me now, and you'll find everything you need to know there. Once you know these, then you're ready to carry on with this session. Once you've done that, then you can see below that you've achieved milestones A, B, and C. You can define, you can give strengths and weaknesses, and you can use those golden key terms to talk about the research methods covered so far. Now, what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be looking at positivism, and particularly we're going to be looking at structured interviews and closed question questionnaires, the methods that positivists will use. So, what exactly is a positivist? Well, positivists try and study society in the same way that natural scientists study the human body or maybe the human brain. So let's think about it like this. A psychologist might compare the brain of a criminal with that of a non-criminal, and they might be able to observe differences in their brain development to establish facts about human behaviour. Well, a sociologist who identifies as a positivist tries to do the exact same thing. Emil Durkheim, for example, he compared societies across Europe, and he found overwhelming evidence that certain societies had higher suicide rates than others. Well, maybe by measuring and observing such differences, we can establish facts about the social world. So one example of the kind of research that positivists might like can be seen in Alice Sullivan's study of cultural capital. Now, she wanted to test this concept that the middle class might have some kind of advantage when it comes to getting good grades and when it comes to building a rapport with their teachers in school. But one thing that she had to do in order to make this research empirical was she had to measure how much cultural capital someone might have. In order to do research, every sociologist has to choose a method of social inquiry, and the method that Sullivan used in this case was a questionnaire. She administered a questionnaire to 465 students across 4 comprehensive schools. So we know Sullivan wanted to use a questionnaire in order to measure how much cultural capital a student may have. So what did she do? Well, she gave students a list of written questions, she asked them to self-complete, and she asked them to go through and to check off things stating what particular materials they'd read over the last couple of years, and even did a test where she tried to work out if they could identify the names of some cultural famous figures, like Karl Marx, like Tony Blair. So the idea here was that she could measure how much knowledge of the cultural and social world a student could have. Now, once Sullivan found a way to measure cultural capital, she could then correlate that with the grade that a student got. And the idea is that as your level of cultural capital goes up, so will your grade. So one example that she found, people who spent their time watching political affairs documentaries compared to people who spent their time watching like reality TV shows obviously would have got higher grades. Now, what you're seeing here is using this positivist, using this quantitative method of research, it allows us to establish patterns and trends. And what we can do here is we can work out a pattern of educational attainment based on which group you belong to, a group with high or a group with low cultural capital. Now, another interesting finding from Sullivan's research was that if your parents were more likely to have gone to university, then you're more likely yourself to have a higher rate of cultural capital. She worked this out by asking students at the top of the questionnaire to report on their parents' highest level of educational attainment. And then she was able to correlate that with how well they responded to other questions, like recognizing some famous figures. The idea here was that she could look at a pattern and trend, but the research was not foolproof. There were 2 major issues. So one of them, these students did a self-complete questionnaire. Let's say, for example, they didn't know their parents' level of educational attainment. They might have lied, or they might have guessed, and therefore what she's measuring may not actually be the truth. Another issue Sullivan found was that she couldn't get an overly large sample. Now, 465 participants is amazing for a PhD student, but we would hardly say that this is representative on a macro scale. Hopefully by now you can start to see that positivists use quantitative methods like questionnaires in order to measure the social world. Well, this isn't the only method that positivists use. Another method that you might find is a structured interview. This is basically the same thing as a questionnaire. The only difference is that the researcher and the interviewer get a chance to interact face to face. The researcher reads out the question, the participant states their answer, and the researcher checks it accordingly. Now, the thing with structured interviews is they are extremely numerical and only collect quantitative data. Participants tend to get asked closed questions. So in the case of Peter Townsend, he carried out structured interviews with a range of groups across society to try and work out which groups were living with poverty that was so severe that they couldn't really enjoy an everyday normal life. Now, what he did was he went to a range of different houses and he asked them all the same set of questions. Now, if you think about it, Townsend's studying a very big, broad concept, poverty. What does it mean to say you live in poverty? Well, if you look at the list above me, Townsend broke this down into some key sections. And he wanted to examine poverty on a range of principles, looking at things like how much cash income do you have? Do you own your own property? What kind of health problems do you go through? What kind of house do you live in? And what kind of employment have you been given? Obviously, someone who's on a low income might then find that they live in low socioeconomic, low class housing. It might find that they have less cash coming in. They might find that their general quality of life, of course, deteriorates from having this low income. But the important thing is that Townsend really analysed what it meant to live in poverty so that, again, we could look at this in quite an objective way. From a slightly more detailed examination of Townsend's study, we can start to see some of the strengths and weaknesses of his methodology. So one thing we should probably look at is how did Townsend achieve his sample? Now, his sample is considered highly representative, which implies two things. One, there was a lot of people in the sample, and Townsend studied thousands. But two, Townsend claims that he managed to gather a range of groups covering all the different types of people that you might expect to be living across the UK. So for this reason, we would say his research is highly representative. It represents society as a whole. The other thing that we might credit in his research is the way that he achieved reliability. Now, if you've looked at these key terms before, you'll know that reliability means consistency. The idea that you could repeat a study and keep getting the same results, or you could ask another participant and get a similar finding. Now, Townsend kind of did this within his own research. When he went to all these different houses across the UK to ask them about their experience and what kind of poverty they might have lived in, when he did this, he would always ask every member of the household to answer the same set of questions. And what that meant was that he could check to see that their answers are really consistent and in agreement with each other. However, despite having a really reliable set of data and a really representative sample, Townsend's research is not without his errors. So one of the things that we might notice when we examine his structured interview is that he asked participants to state their usual income. Well, this might be a difficult one to answer. Let's say one participant had just got a pay rise, and then they might start to answer the question based on their new income, meanwhile talking about their quality of life based on their old income. That's inconsistent, so that's kind of damaging the reliability. And the other thing is that we're not going to get the truth if participants are misinterpreting exactly what the question means. So maybe some of the data that Townsend's collected isn't as accurate or isn't as valid as he hoped it would be. So now you can see two examples of the types of research that positivists might value. You've got Alice Sullivan, who used a questionnaire in order to measure cultural capital, and then you've got Townsend, who used a structured interview in order to measure which groups in society were suffering poverty. Now, we are going to look at one more case study before we finish, but this is not necessarily someone who advocates for using quantitative methods. We're going to look at Sudhir Venkatesh, who initially tried to study gangs using a questionnaire and kind of found out that this probably wasn't the right method to use. From an ethical point of view, this is probably one of the most fascinating studies that we are ever going to look at. So how did it all start? Well, Venkatesh wanted to try and understand what it was like to be in a gang, and he thought that he might be able to measure the kind of experiences, the everyday activities that gang members got themselves involved with. He thought he might be able to measure their attitudes towards things like the police and society as a whole. But when he approached a gang with a questionnaire, he was met with a bit of a surprising situation. First of all, they kidnapped him. And second of all, when they finally accepted, okay, you're not some rival gang person trying to get intel on us, you are actually a sociologist who are trying to study gangs, they then gave him a piece of advice. And they basically said, if you want to understand what it's like to be in a gang, you cannot use this tiny little questionnaire and have any kind of meaningful understanding of us. So if you want to know what it's like to be in a gang, come with us, follow us around, we'll show you what it's like. Venkatesh ditched the questionnaire and he opted for a far more qualitative method. He decided to observe the gang and really share their experiences. Now, this just highlights one of the major issues with using questionnaires. There is just not enough depth and meaning in a participant checking a box that's ever going to help you really understand their experience and what their life's like on a day-to-day basis. Okay, so that's going to bring us to the end of this tutorial, and today what we've looked at, if you want to see above, we've looked at why positivists prefer quantitative methods, we've looked at the types of methods they use, including questionnaires and structured interviews. We've looked at the particular cases of Alice Sullivan, of Townsend, and of Venkatesh. And finally, we've established the real strengths and weaknesses of using these positivist methods. Well, that's all for now, and I'll see you next lesson when we're going to look at interpretivism.